So thank you all for attending this first in a series of 3 lectures on God and the Bard. That was Tom's idea, the title, so I have to give credit where credit's due. And I will be exploring in these 3 lectures the relationship between the Judeo-Christian God of Renaissance Europe and how Shakespeare employed, subverted, or sanctioned religious ideas in his works, and also what the message for us might be nowadays. So this week we will be examining Romeo and Juliet. Speak again, bright angel, the gospel according to Romeo. So Romeo and Juliet is probably the most famous of Shakespeare's 37 plays, and there are many strong contenders for that title. His 1596 play, an early mega hit for the budding 31-year-old poet turned playwright, is renowned for its infamous feuding families, shocking violence, and blazing love of its titular star-crossed lovers. For those in need of a brief plot summary, I thought this comic would be very helpful in jogging your memory on the essential plot point of the play. Spoiler alert in the 3rd panel there, but you've had 400 years to read this play, so you've got no sympathy from me if I've spoiled the ending for you. However, aside from the glamour of the poetry, the sex, and the violence, a lesser known aspect of this play is its persistent and very beautiful religious imagery, which pervades the text and infuses it with symbolism and weight. Shakespeare tells us in the 2nd line of the play that we are in fair Verona, giving us an Italian context and therefore, of course, a firmly Roman Catholic context. While Shakespeare was born a generation after Henry's Reformation, old habits seem to die hard. And while much ink has been spilled on the question of whether Shakespeare was a Catholic, the jury is out but leaning towards a no. What is clear is his use of religious symbolism to enhance his dramas. This can be something of a surprise to people who remember Romeo and Juliet's much more famous and frank expressions of love, sex, and desire. Even those who have never read or watched the play can recognize the image of a girl on a balcony and a boy underneath reaching up to her. Fun fact, Shakespeare makes no mention of a balcony. All it says is enter Juliet above. So the balcony scene actually doesn't have a balcony. I don't know when that might be useful to you, maybe in a pub quiz scenario, but you never know. However, the play's first interaction between its titular characters in Act 1, Scene 5 is not a lustful whirlwind of words and bodies, that comes later, but rather it is a measured and very beautiful shared speech filled with religious imagery. But before we dive into that speech, a little background. Now, I know that most of you will not have dipped your toes in the shark-infested waters of dating for some time now, so let me tell you just how bad things are today. If a man has his eye on someone now, he might be awfully brave and text the lady of his choice, yes, text, not even call, with something profound and flattering, to him anyway, such as morning beautiful, all lowercase, of course, congratulating himself on his razor-sharp wit and charm. Now, while this woeful level of romantic and grammatical effort is subpar even by 21st century standards, the Renaissance gentleman would have been positively horrified at this lackadaisical approach. In the same way that the birds of paradise of Papua New Guinea's rainforests must engage in elaborate courtship performances with the sole aim of attracting a female, so the Renaissance gentleman had to engage in no less an elaborate performance of his love and adoration to impress his chosen lady. In this description from Shakespeare's comedy, As You Like It, of how a lovesick man should behave, we can see that he should be in a terrible state of distress and discomfort through lack of sleep and food, because he is so tormented from pining after his lady love. Gentlemen, take note. You should have a lean cheek, a blue eye and sunken, a beard neglected, your hose, trousers, pants should be ungartered, your bonnet unbanded, your sleeve unbuttoned, your shoe untied, and everything about you demonstrating a careless desolation. It is this kind of devotion that is sorely missing from today's dating theme. But what, I hear you cry, is a Renaissance gentleman to do with all this pent-up emotion? Well, in the absence of any Adele albums to listen to, in 1590s Europe, there was only one answer: to write a sonnet pouring out your feelings. This famous love poetry form began, of course, in Italy in the 1200s and comes from the Italian word sonetto, meaning little song. Its form was developed and refined over the subsequent 3 centuries until it reached its peak during Shakespeare's heyday. Here is his famous Sonnet 116, which is oft recited at weddings due to its invocation of the marriage vows in the first 2 lines. Some of you might be familiar with this. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out, even to the edge of doom. If this be error, and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. This is a great example of the classic sonnet structure. 14 lines long, a strict A-B rhyme scheme, which you can see I've indicated there. And this is repeated for 3 quatrains before culminating in the final rhyming couplet that usually contains a decisive or summarizing statement on love. In this case, Shakespeare dares the reader to find fault with his assessment that love lasts even to the edge of doom and prove him a liar. While Shakespeare is most famous now as a playwright, his first claim to fame was actually as a purveyor of smutty poetry, having published 2 racy narrative poems in the early 1590s, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, and it is suspected that many of his sonnets were written around the time he was composing these poems. It was the light-hearted, highly erotic Venus and Adonis that launched the bard's career. In it, the irresistible god of love, sex, and desire, Venus, there she is in all her glory at the bottom, or Aphrodite to the Greeks, from which we, of course, would derive the word aphrodisiac, she does the unthinkable and falls for a mortal man, whom she pursues relentlessly, trying everything from physical seduction to emotional blackmail to have him. But Adonis remains unmoved, preferring to hunt instead. But this hobby of his proves fatal, as he is killed by a wild boar, and Venus is left broken-hearted. The poem was an immediate bestseller and was reprinted 9 times during the author's lifetime. Sex sells is not just a recent marketing phenomenon, and Shakespeare understood this well enough to relocate that sexually charged poetry into the budding form of English Renaissance tragedy. By the time Shakespeare turned to writing drama, this early grounding in erotic poetry set him up perfectly for writing an expansive, heartbreaking tragedy on young lovers cruelly divided by circumstance. But Romeo's struggles do not begin after he falls in love with Juliet. They are present at the start of the play. In the early part of Romeo and Juliet, we learn that Romeo has been courting another young woman, Rosaline, but without much success, because she'll not be hit with Cupid's arrow, she hath Dian's wit. Both these deities are armed with a bow and arrows, as you can see from these very beautiful statues of the two. But while Cupid, on the left, his arrows strike us with love and desire, the famously virginal huntress Diana will go to war to defend against any threats to her chastity, or the chastity of the young girls who worshipped her as their protectress. The one man who dared to lust after Diana came to a very sorry end, when the hunter Actaeon, who mistakenly saw Diana, or Artemis to the Greeks, bathing with her maidens, and could not look away from the goddess's very beautiful but very naked body. And he was transformed by the goddess of the hunt into a stag, and had to flee from his own hunting hounds, who eventually tore him apart. The hunter became the hunted. The goddess's cruel and ironic revenge was swift and horrific, and Romeo's invocation of Diana hints at the depth of his pain at being refused, as well as his own rejection of the virginity that Diana and Rosaline obviously held dear. While Romeo is pining away, he begs his cousin Benvolio, "Teach me how I should forget to think of her." And Benvolio's reply is something we have all uttered to our love-lorn friends: Give liberty unto thine eyes, examine other beauties. Benvolio sagely reminds us that there are always plenty more fish in the sea. Romeo takes this advice to heart, and a few scenes later, he has snuck his way into the Capulets' masquerade ball, to which he, of course, would not be invited, being a Montague and the son of the Capulets' deadly enemy. At this party, we can see that oldest of cliches, Romeo spotting Juliet across a crowded room, dancing with another man, famously declaring, "Did my heart love till now? Forswear its sight, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this night." And this spurs our pining lover to forget his previous subpar efforts at courtship and to up his game. So how does he do this? Why, with a sonnet, of course. So let's have a look at the sonnet performed in the excellent 1996 Romeo and Juliet film with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. I would thoroughly recommend watching this version of the play, as it captures the rage, love, speed, and despair of Shakespeare's text so perfectly. And I've checked online, and it's available to those with a Disney Plus subscription. So there you go. So let's have a look. Now, this is the moment where I'm hoping the technology will be really, really kind. So let's give this a go. I hope you can hear this.
I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle sin is this. My lips, blushing pilgrims ready stand, good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much. Which mannerly devotion shows in this? For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Have not saints' lips and holy palmer's.
Sorry. Who? Audio's not working. Is that right? Oh dear. Oh. Sad times. Is there a way I can fix the screen share to be the audio?
My pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. Well then, dear saint, what lips do what hands do? They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. Saints do not move, they grant for prayer's sake. Then move not while my prayers effect I take. Oh! As from my lips by thine my sin is purged. And have my lips the sin that they have took? Sin from my lips, O trespass sweetly urged, give me my sin again. You kissed by the book.
Okay, hopefully that worked for you. I'm sorry if it didn't, but hopefully it did. If it didn't work, it's on Disney Plus. Knock yourself out. It's really great. So when I have taught this play to a group of hormone-dazed teenagers, I have had various reactions, ranging from the semi-profound, "So, miss, is desire holy?" Oh, Tom, you've unmuted yourself on the phone. Mute yourself there. There we go. Thank you. And so, yeah, kids will ask me, "So, Mrs. Desire holy?" I've even had the, "Why would you ever talk to a girl you wanted about God?" Both of these are fair questions, and I will attempt to answer them through analysis and discussion of this key moment in the play. At the beginning of this interaction, Romeo places himself in a humbled position, that of an unworthy pilgrim who wishes to worship at the shrine of Juliet's beauty. While hyperbole was long a feature of sonnets, which girl doesn't want to hear she's worth worshipping, his choice of religious imagery here is in keeping with pre-Reformation religious practices. Before Henry smashed the power of the monasteries and created the Church of England, there was a flourishing and lively pilgrimage scene in Catholic England, with thousands of people travelling every year in search of a touch of sanctity, or perhaps some mental, physical, and spiritual healing in a time before antibiotics, vaccines, and psychotherapy. Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales was centred around a motley crew of pilgrims from every walk of medieval English life, planning to journey from the Tabard Inn in what's now Talbot's Yard in Southwark in London to the city of Canterbury in Kent to visit the shrine of St Thomas Becket. And they wished to tell each other stories to pass the time on the journey. Now, while this 60-mile journey can now be achieved in 1 hour 52 minutes, excluding toll roads, it would take quite a lot longer by foot. If Lonely Planet had been around at the time, they almost certainly would have produced travel guides for the discerning pilgrim wanting their spiritual fix, and they would have had plenty of choices of location, both in England and farther afield. English pilgrims could journey to Glastonbury in the southwest due to legends of Joseph of Arimathea visiting, and they could go to Lindisfarne in the northeast due to its connection with St Aidan and St Cuthbert. Many would also travel to Walsingham in Norfolk, where the Lady Richelieu de Fabergé had a vision of the Virgin Mary, who instructed her to build a replica of the Holy House in Nazareth. Sadly, this was destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries. But some English pilgrims had ambitions that lay much farther afield than this. Italy was a very popular choice of destination, with the pilgrimage route beginning at Canterbury, at the cathedral, and continuing an unbroken 1,200 miles to Rome, taking about 75 days on foot. Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, where the remains of St. James, Santiago in Spanish, is still a very popular route for pilgrims to walk, with 500,000 people walking the Camino Frances in 2024. There's the route of it there, and this takes about 4 to 5 weeks if you're not in a hurry. But the undeniable gold medalist of pilgrims was the medieval English mystic and devoted pilgrimage enthusiast Margery Kempe, who woke up one day in 1413 and announced to her husband and father of her 14 children that she was going to take what we would now call a sabbatical and travel all the way from her home in Norfolk to Jerusalem, a distance of about 2,773 miles. You can see the Google Maps version of it there. Coincidentally, Margery also told her husband that they were now going to have a chaste marriage because God told her so. And she even records her husband's unintentionally hilarious reply, which was that it was good to be chaste, but not yet. Prior to this, Margery had already won Norfolk's Parishioner of the Year award because listening to Christ's passion and death at church every day distressed her so much that she would bawl her eyes out loudly during the Mass. Obviously, it's not just little children that Jesus had to suffer coming to him. She travelled from Norfolk to mainland Europe. Here's her route, where she joined a group of pilgrims heading through France, Germany, and the Alps towards Venice, where she boarded a ship that stopped in Cyprus and Rhodes before landing at Jaffa, taking an armed guard, and finally arriving in Jerusalem, where she stayed for 3 weeks. Naturally, when she made it to Calvary and Gethsemane, she burst into uncontrollable sobbing and could not be consoled. Her record of this journey has given her the distinction of being the first autobiography written in the English language, and by a woman too, although she had to dictate it to a priest as she was herself illiterate. While even Margery's fellow pilgrims did not understand or share her peculiar fervour, her piety and devotion to travelling to sacred places does emphasise the significance of such places of pilgrimage in the minds of Christians at that time. And Shakespeare would have been surrounded by individuals who had heard such stories, or perhaps had gone on pilgrimage themselves pre-Reformation. Romeo's framing of his attraction for Juliet within the context of a pilgrim seeking solace and comfort is therefore a deeply flattering comparison, made all the more meaningful because devotion to God was considered the most powerful feeling of all. In their shared sonnet, religious devotion and sexual longing are so intertwined that they become indistinguishable. Now, this is definitely an unusual approach to love in a Christian context, as ever since Eve ate the fruit and offered her husband some, womankind has had a lot to live down, and the female body has been viewed as a source of shame. You can see here just how differently the two women are portrayed in art. Sadly, embarrassment at the apparently provocative nature of the female form is a view that still persists to this day in many social contexts. One glance at American television tells you that any amount of gun violence is acceptable, but a bare breast is an absolute no-no. Anyone who has ever wandered through a European art gallery will note just how demurely Mary is always painted, all wrapped up very well in acres of blue and red fabric, with only her face and hands on display, as opposed to her dangerously sexually liberated counterpart, Mary Magdalene. You see at the bottom there the difference, who always seems to be presented in various states of undress, with her long, loose, flowing hair, denoting her correspondingly loose morals, of course, and this hair barely covers her exposed body, which often seems to be in the throes of ecstasy. Consider the disgust every church seems to have at the idea that Jesus could have been the result of a sexual encounter between Mary and Joseph, much preferring the idea of Jesus' conception being a suspension of natural law, rather than because of anything quite so grubby as sexual desire. It seems that the only two options for women in Christianity then are either to be a virgin or to be a whore. So where does that leave sex and desire? As undesirable stains on humanity about which we must feel guilty? As an embarrassment of the human condition that we don't talk about in polite society, in the same category as defecation or drunkenness? Humans have twisted themselves into all sorts of linguistic knots to avoid discussing intimacy directly. Think of all those times you've ever heard someone say, "We're trying for a baby." Have you ever stopped to think just how truly weird that remark is, as the person in front of you is effectively announcing that they and their partner are swinging from the chandeliers as often as they can, barely coming up for air, the house positively quaking from their heroic efforts, but it's okay because it's just for reproduction and therefore not salacious or inappropriate at all. In light of all this, it is tempting to lose hope about sex and desire in a Christian context. As none of us was immaculate conceptions, and we're all here because our parents were trying for a baby, are we sinful then too? Our wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, doomed to fall short of the church's impossible virgin whore standard? It is certainly curious that Jesus' divinity should seem to depend so much on the asexuality of his mother. If he'd been conceived the old-fashioned way like the rest of us, would that have made his teachings any the less true or meaningful? It also forces me to question why Matthew and Luke spent so much time laying out Joseph's ancestry if he had nothing to do with it, but that is a different lecture. We can at least point the finger at the culprits who engendered this mistranslation about Mary's status, as the Greeks translated Isaiah's prophecy from the Hebrew word alma, meaning young woman of marriageable age, to the Greek word parthenos, which did mean a virgin, and it was this translation that the New Testament writers used. The word Parthenos gave its name, of course, to the Parthenon in Athens, the temple dedicated to the famously virginal warrior goddess Athena, and of course her name still lives on in the Greek capital's name, Athens. Interestingly enough, the Parthenon was converted to a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary in the 6th century AD. Given the church's long-standing belief in the virgin birth, which they can hardly give up on now without losing considerable face, there has therefore always been a tension surrounding sex and desire in Christianity, that it is somehow a necessary evil that Christians must tolerate or grudgingly put up with, like backache or embarrassing relatives. Thankfully, Shakespeare is having none of it. And to him, sexual longing and desire deserves to be elevated to the status of the sacred, because arguably it is the fullest expression, it is the fulfillment of the other half of Jesus' great commandment to us. After we have loved God with all our heart and soul and mind and body, we must do the same for others. I defy anybody who has ever been happily coupled up to tell me that their love did not involve the whole of their mind, body, heart, and soul. Romeo understands that love is an all-consuming devotion to something sacred, and it is therefore the greatest expression of God's commandment to love and serve others. Romeo and Juliet become completely absorbed in their first interaction, as evidenced by the fact that Juliet matches Romeo's semantic field, wit and structure in her speech. She recognizes his self-deprecating language of pilgrimage. She recognizes the sonnet structure being deployed here, and she responds to him in kind. Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much. We can see that her desire matches his, her wit matches his, and they are perfectly paired. Two households, both alike in dignity, indeed. Her tentative invitation that their hands join and the attendant symbolism of marriage within that is a playful and coy expression of their mutual desire for one another. She is obviously delighted at his mannerly devotion, but like all smart girls, she plays hard to get, and she reminds him gently but firmly that saints have hands, that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palm's kiss. So in other words, a kiss is too forward, but holding hands is nice for now. Juliet's suggestion they touch palm to palm is a deferential act that implies submission on Romeo's part, and this makes their interaction sacred rather than profane. Now, speaking of sacred encounters, when Margery Kemp returned from Jerusalem, it is highly likely that her Lonely Planet Guide to Pilgrimage would have recommended to her that she take a palm branch as a token of the journey undertaken. This is not just souvenir hunting, of course, but a homage to there's not just souvenir hunting, but of course, an homage to those who heralded Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem by waving palm branches. But what the palm represents is less triumphant. Palm Sunday is a highly bittersweet occasion for Christians, as it is the beginning of the end for Jesus, at least in his earthly form. This moment in Shakespeare's play is similarly bittersweet and ironic, as this is the moment that sets their love in motion, but also when the wheels of tragedy begin to turn and their journey towards their deaths is started. Both their journey and Jesus' journey begins in worship, and both end in sacrifice for love. Remember, it is only after this exchange that Romeo and Juliet learn who the other is. So at this point, they are innocent of the knowledge that will destroy them. They are in their sinless, Edenic state, if you will, enjoying the briefest taste of paradise before it is cruelly snatched away. Not one to be put off that easily, Romeo changes tack in the following lines, focusing on the object of veneration at the shrines frequented by so many pilgrims. Saints, holy individuals who have lived lives of extraordinary piety or virtue, or have been martyred for such. The very earliest saints within the Christian church were usually those who were martyrs to the faith. St. Stephen being stoned to death and St. Peter being crucified upside down in Rome are famous early examples, as was my namesake, St. Cecilia, the patron saint of music and musicians, who had a particularly grisly end for refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods. Officials tried to suffocate her or submerge her in a vat of scalding liquid. Accounts vary, but she was unharmed. And then 3 blows to the neck with a sword did not kill her, and she lived for another 3 days after this, during which time she distributed all her wealth to the poor. Her fortitude in the face of adversity certainly puts my own first world problems into perspective. Canonization as a process was not centralized until nearly 1,000 years after the church's foundation, when St. Ulrich of Augsburg was canonized by the Pope in 993, and it is the Pope who has decided all cases of sainthood ever since. In case you're interested, St. Ulrich's intercession was credited with the defeat of the 1856-57 Rocky Mountain locust plague in central Minnesota, and that genus of locust is now extinct, so make of that intercession what you will. But Juliet's elevation from shrine to saint is her doing, not his. She casts herself in the role of spiritual figure, in control of the metaphor, as she seeks to be approached with reverence and humility. This reflects the position of the saint as physically removed from base passion, but also able to grant intercession to the faithful. But her language betrays her. She's not a distant, untouchable saint, but a young woman already drawn to him, even as she speaks of restraint. The pilgrim's lips are humble but filled with longing, and their telltale blush is indicative of their desire. The connection of palm to palm is chaste but highly intimate. While inhabiting the religious metaphor, she's also ready to undermine it, buying herself time and emotional distance to process this most unexpected courtship. After the 8th line of any sonnet, there's usually a volta or turn, meaning that whatever has been mused upon in the first 2 quatrains is now developed in a different direction. Perhaps the speakers come to realization, or they deliberately undermine what they had considered true in the first half. In this case, there is a tonal shift from the sacred to the sensual. Romeo makes a perfectly reasonable argument that lips pray just as much as hands do, and are perhaps even more effective. As pickup lines go, this must surely rank as one of the smoothest in history, and it certainly seems to be working on Juliet. At shrines across Europe, pilgrims would speak their prayers there, imploring the saints to intercede on their behalf. And the pilgrims would hope that their prayers would be answered and they would grant them, just as Romeo hopes his desires will be sated. Juliet's resolve is clearly tested as she acknowledges that saints do not move, in other words, do not change their minds. But she's happy to engage in a little more playful fishing, implying that the right prayer will unlock the heavenly rewards. As is so often the case, Shakespeare engages in wordplay and dual meanings, and Romeo willfully misinterprets the move and playfully commands her to remain still while he makes both his prayer and reaps its rewards with a kiss. This is the longed-for moment when chaste wordplay becomes physical reality. The kiss is both sacred and daring, setting the tone for the rest of the play. This isn't just flattery. It reflects a Christian vision of desire as something spiritually charged, even redemptive. Romeo is a profane sinner in need of absolution, and Juliet is the only saint who can grant that absolution. She is his salvation, in other words. Her reference to kissing by the book both refers to the Bible and its associated sanctity, but it is also vital feedback on the quality of the kiss received. In other words, 10 out of 10. The reference to Romeo sin being purged is a clear allusion to Catholic doctrine of purgatory, whereby those destined for heaven but dying in a state of imperfection may, after a time of spiritual purification after death, eventually reach the bliss of heaven. One of the earliest and most famous references to purgatory in world literature comes in Dante's Divine Comedy, the epic narrative poem where the author takes the reader on a journey through Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, and all that he sees happening to the souls of the deceased in these places. Now, I just want to take you through the punishments for those who are in purgatory. Here are the punishments for those in purgatory. So the prideful must bend under the weight of heavy stones. The slothful have to run ultra marathons, as you see. The gluttonous had to go on the 5-2 diet, and the lustful had to have the desire burned out of them with fire. You can see number 7 there, being chastity being the reward. The last of these sins is the fine line that Romeo and Juliet are walking. Their culture dictates their desire for each other must be chaste, but in Shakespeare's world, the source of Romeo's desire will chasten and cleanse that desire. Desire is therefore not corrupting, but purifying. In the end, their deaths become the means by which Verona is purged of its hate, in much the same way as Jesus' death purified mankind. I'm afraid I need to skip my Hamlet thing because we're running out of time. Here we go. So later in Romeo and Juliet, Romeo is banished from Verona due to murdering Juliet's cousin Tybalt, and he views this as worse than death. Banishment, be merciful, say death. The exile hath more terror in his look, much more than death. Do not say banishment. And then he laments, there is no world without Verona walls, but purgatory, torture, hell itself. The trinity of suffering emphasizes that his torment of being separated from Juliet goes beyond the physical and into the realm of the spiritual. His earlier hopeful purging of his sin by her kiss becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that tests his resolve and ultimately breaks him. In Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare draws deeply on Christian theology, especially Catholic ideas of sin, repentance, and the afterlife, to enrich the emotional and moral complexity of his characters. Whether or not readers and audiences believe in purgatory or salvation, we can at least recognize the language and emotional weight of these ideas. The lovers' shared sonnet frames their attraction in the language of pilgrimage, saints, and holy devotion, even as their passion ultimately leads them to suffering and sacrifice. Shakespeare's intermingling of religious love and sexual love gives our lovers, and by extension us, permission to strive for love as the noblest and highest possible human experience. So when my students ask me, so miss, is desire holy? It seems that according to Shakespeare, the answer is yes. And as for why would you ever talk to a girl you wanted about God, the answer seems to be because it's clearly a successful flirtation strategy. Because in this most famous of romantic literary interactions, Shakespeare is also reminding us that for all its passion, love is also one giant leap of faith. Thank you very much. And I'm about to get kicked off. So let's jump on the second link now. Thank you all very much.